Hello everyone and very warm welcome. To begin with, as we do in Australia, I would like to invite you to join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we are gathered on today. It's very difficult when we're so gathered in many places. For me, that's the land of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also warmly welcome First Nations people from across Australia and elsewhere to this webinar this evening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marg Hay. I'm the Professor of Enterprising Education at Monash University, which is a really fancy name, and I head the Monash Centre for Professional Development Education. And most of my academic work in the past 2 decades has been in the professional development education space with a particular focus on health professions education. And I notice, and we've been chatting while we were waiting to begin, that a lot of my colleagues and friends from our Harvard Macy Institute Collaborative Leadership and Innovation in Health course have registered for this seminar. And although we haven't been able to run the course in 2021, rest assured that we will do it as soon as we are able. We will gather again. I'm getting lots and lots of calls about when we can do it, and as soon as we can, we will. But I do expect your full engagement in an active discussion this evening. So pressure is on all of the Harvard Macy course alumni. But right now, I'm really excited to announce a new collaboration that we have formed with Neuropower Group. This collaboration is really very much aligned to the principles and values of both Monash and the Neuropower Group, and that's why we have connected. We like to connect with people who share our values, and the Neuropower Group certainly do that. In particular, how we approach our education in the very broad area of health. So a little bit about Neuropower. Neuropower is a highly regarded behavioural strategy firm working internationally, but based in Australia. It specialises in human behaviour, leadership and the future of work in healthcare, so very much needed right now. And in all their work, they use a combination of the latest insights from social cognitive neuroscience, behavioural economics, which I know a lot of you have asked for more content on, so we've delivered that, and also leading best practice to help amazing leaders such as you to deliver extraordinary results in the face of increasing pressures that we've all experienced in the last couple of years. Full disclosure for me that I have completed a Neuropower course. I want to say I liked it so much that I bought the company, but collaboration is much better. And I'm speaking absolutely sincerely that I gained so much from this course in understanding myself, others around me, and also the systems in which I work. And these learnings have been so helpful to me in navigating the uncertainties that have been thrust upon all of us during the last 2 years because of the pandemic. So I actually did the course pre-pandemic and very, very grateful that I did. So tonight we're joined by 3 of the Neuropower team who together bring more than 25 years of experience in helping leaders navigate a raft of challenges and to make the most of big opportunities. And we like the big opportunities. Peter Burrow is the founding partner and author of the Neuropower System, which integrates more than a dozen fields of study from over 50 frameworks. And it's an incredible framework, and his book is over 1,000 pages. I think if you look behind Rachel, you'll see that you will see the book. But it's just phenomenal what Peter has managed to synthesise in that framework. And Anna Byrne specialises in shaping mindsets and decisions and behaviours, particularly helping clinical boards, multidisciplinary teams, clinical services, and cross-organisational partnerships to work effectively. And I think we can all imagine what that would be like in healthcare if we could achieve that. And Rachel Morrow is currently completing her PhD on how health outcomes in Queensland and Victorian emergency services are shaped by the extent to which the workforce needs are met and as they transition from that initial training to the high pressure environment. So that's super exciting research as well. So this webinar is interactive. That can only happen if you contribute. There will be breakout rooms and so on, but in the meantime, please use the raise hand or chat function or just speak up. The session is also being recorded for those who couldn't join or if you want to revisit it later. So please join me in welcoming you and welcoming the Neuropower team who will lead our interactive discussion on the big 3 drivers that contribute to shaping health leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margan. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and some new friends as well. So as Marg said, we're here to explore some of the challenges that are shaping health now and into the future. And I think for many of us working across various health systems, there's a very understandable focus at the moment, obviously on COVID. But not all of our current challenges are a product of the pandemic. In fact, in many cases, it's simply latent issues that already existed that the pandemic has amplified that we're really grappling with at the moment. So today we wanted to share with you the 3 key drivers that are actively recasting the role of health leaders independent of the pandemic. They're challenges that we're seeing now and that we'll continue to see over the years to come. And these are the key trends that we're consistently seeing across different types of health organisations. So regardless of geography, type of service you might be providing, where you play in the healthcare continuum, these are the big things that health leaders everywhere will be grappling with now and into the future. But first of all, we wanted to get a bit of a sense of us as a group. Obviously, it's the first time this group is gathering together. And so we're wanting to get a quick check-in and a sense of, a few words, just sort of 3 key words, less common words ideally, that best describe how you're feeling at the start of our time together. And Rachel's just popped a little Pollev link into the chat. So if everyone can sort of find your way there, hopefully it's pretty easy. You don't need to do any logins or anything like that. Just a quick click and it should relatively swiftly get you to the point where you can pop in your 3 words for how you're feeling this evening or this morning for those of us joining from Europe. Welcome to Dublin contingent. How's everyone feeling at the start of our time together? There was a bit of a pause as we wait to see whether everyone can actually manage the technology. I think in health, we're very good at holding, bated breath as we wait to see whether it actually decides to play nicely. Oh, there we go. Somebody's in. Anticipatory. Oh, I love that. Excited and energized. That is deeply impressive for an evening session for those who are in an evening time zone. Also, we've got tired starting to come to the fore. The emergent winner. Who would have had decent money bet on tired, weary, or exhausted being one of the main ones that comes out? It's fascinating, isn't it? I think it is that general sense of weariness across many of us in health and indeed many other industries. But what I'm loving as I look at that there, it's got some hot contenders for alternatives there. Look at that, Peter.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I love that. Optimistic, excited, curious. Now we're getting into the technology. We've got anxious there, which is interesting. Ambitious, learn.
A little bit uncertain. I love whoever put included in there. That's fantastic. Somebody did put vaccine, which I wonder whether it was meant to go in partnership with one of the other words or whether someone's actually just had their jab and is feeling terribly vaccinated, which would be a great way to feel at this point. Supported, some hunger there. So you can see some physiological things there. Someone feeling new. But isn't that wonderful that even with all of that variation across us as a group, we've got a lot of curiosity, a lot of excitement, a lot of optimism that's sort of giving our weariness and fatigue a good run for its money, which is great. Beautiful. So that might just sort of continue to keep on moving through. If you're sort of almost there, please do hit send. It's always great to get a sense of the group and we'll keep on and keeping an eye on that. But we might move in to start sharing some of those 3 drivers that we mentioned and kick on into the first one. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. And it is fantastic to be here and exploring this spot with you, this area. And when I say spot, I mean blind spot, which is this idea that we have this leadership vacuum. The big idea is that you have a technical pipeline, and we're very good at that. We're very good at learning clinical pipelines. In other words, where you've got a good layered career for people. We're very good at management, which is managing complexity in terms of complex systems, but not necessarily the people part. So what's missing is the way we divide our work vertically for people. And this is very different from a Newtonian machine. So if you've got a new organization, and it doesn't matter where in health you work, we're pretty good at saying this vertical functional area should go together. And there's an old view, which is, and it's not necessarily a wrong view, but it comes from this idea that excellence comes from a critical mass. You need a certain number of people. So we put all our clinicians together in this area and our nurses together in that area, and we group them according to function. What we're not good at doing, regardless of the horizontal functional models, we're not good at saying, what do people do from a leadership perspective at each layer of the organization? And this creates consistently problems right through the organization. So if you were to look at this pipeline, and this was originally developed by Steve Drotter, and for those of you who are interested in his material, his first book was The Leadership Pipeline. It's one of the most read books from out in the business world, particularly from HR, because it was this new idea that whether or not it doesn't matter what sector you're running, what area you're running, the leadership role at each layer is very similar. So it's predictable. And there are themes to it. So if we were to look at that left-hand funny looking diagram there, you've got individual contributors, then you've got the leaders of those individual contributors, leaders of others. Then you've got leaders of leaders, leaders of function, leaders of the business or the organization, leaders of the group, and the total leaders of the enterprise. And in hospital and health services, your leaders of the enterprise may have half a dozen different facilities over a number of different geographies. They could have intensive areas, but then you could also have research areas, and you may link into universities or collaborative areas. The point here is that the work to be done from a leadership perspective is very different at these different layers, and predictably different. So for example, let's say one of your key values in the organization is empowerment. Well, the principal place for empowerment is leaders of others, because leaders of others are doing the empowering. Now, as an interesting quirk on this, if you've never learnt how to empower, as you move up the chain, you don't suddenly learn the skill later on. So empowerment you learn right at the first level of leadership or management. Leaders of leaders is where you learn efficiency. So you don't drive efficiency at a functional level, you drive efficiency at leader of leaders. And excellence of the function comes from the functional area, not from leaders of others. This is really important because the value that you add at each layer is quite different and it's not intuitive. You don't nut it out. I've coached and worked with now literally hundreds of clinicians. And the message that I get constantly from people in health is, I had no idea. Because everybody has a bit of an idea of what a leader of others does. They're a supervisor. And we know that supervisors have to coordinate the teams and they need to empower them, and there's an element of coaching. But what happens is when we move from there to leaders of leaders, often people just assume that they're a super duper supervisor. And then when they get to leader of function, it's just a super duper supervisor. Like there's no shift of what they're actually doing. This is where health is really suffering, and it's leading to some real problems.
If I can just observe, Peter, as well, it's not just the larger health organisations that are suffering. So this pipeline that Peter's just talked you through, you need in any effective organisation. Sometimes one role will play multiple parts of that pipeline, but you get big problems when you actually don't have that role being played. So even if you have a smaller health organisation and you're in sort of, coordination of services rather than delivery of services, we'll be curious to see, but we'd expect you'd still see the three problems that Peter's about to explain.
So you may have seen this in your own organisation, but I've talked a little to the first one. Organisation issues are being solved at the wrong level. This is huge. So there's this constant question. You come up with cultural change programs, or leadership teams come up with strategies, but they're trying to do the wrong things at the wrong layers. And leaders themselves don't know what they're supposed to be doing at their layer. So if we're looking at leadership in the health sector, and you're particularly wanting to refine your skills as a leader, there are a couple of things you need to do. You need to understand the pipeline. You need to understand this is the leadership pipeline. You need to understand how all those skills layer on each other as you go through the pipeline. And you need to understand where you sit on the pipeline because leadership is different for each of those different layers. It isn't defined. So therefore, you can end up with people, and I've had coaching sessions where you've got somebody responsible for 1,000 staff, and they see their role is to correct people from a clinical perspective, for example. It's not that that's not their role, but that's not their whole role. If they've got a very senior role within the organisation, they've got a whole lot of other stuff that they need to be doing. So the focus is on technical and clinical excellence rather than leadership excellence. And so the big aha here is this is another whole uncharted, undocumented, undealt with, unperformance managed dimension that we need to be able to embrace and wrap our hands around if we're going to have any change. Because organizational strategy is only made possible because leaders are able to translate it to something meaningful at the right layer. And then there's no succession planning. So our leaders feel constantly underprepared because they are. And so exec teams are often talking to me about who do we get to do this role because we don't have anyone ready. Now, what's amazing about the leadership pipeline is that the skills at these different layers are very similar across different areas. They're virtually the same. So a leader of leaders is going to have, from a leadership dimension, very similar skills anywhere in the organization. So it means that from an agility perspective, you're able to move people around, people are able to see what their career looks like, and they're able to develop their skills in those particular dimensions. This is a blind spot for health. The assumption is that you have your clinicians and your frontline people, and that's it. Everyone else is a bit of a waste of money in the leadership, in the management space. And so people, even at we often work, when we're working with CEOs and CEs in the public system, they're not doing the work at that correct layer. They're still working as supervisors, not with the right horizon. So one of the questions that a CE needs to be asking is, why would somebody in year 10 want to come and work for our organization? You know, what's the strategic third horizon imperative for the organization? What are the trends that are going to be hitting us 10 or 15 years down the track? These questions are just not addressed. So you end up with a cascading, and you end up paying a lot of people a lot of money, and they're just not doing the work that needs to be done for the organization to be effective. Excellent.
So I think often we've got an extra contributor. My cat has decided he has a keen interest in health leadership. I think the interesting thing about that, Peter, is often we experience the pain of these problems without necessarily knowing what the source of it is. And so to understand that a lot of those problems, if you're seeing them in your organization, your pipeline is at the heart of it, would be the first takeaway. I think the second thing that's worth noting is there's actually a message of hope there for you as an ambitious health leader, because often we feel like we need to stretch all of the qualities that Peter mentioned, and that's exhausting on top of everything else that we're doing. Whereas if you can understand the core value that is so unique to your, like sort of that central value for you at your layer of the organization, it means you can really hone in and maximize the value and the impact that you're bringing for your team, your peers, your colleagues, and the health system overall. So at this point, that's just the first of our drivers, and we're hoping you'll get a sense. Each of these could easily have been a webinar in and of themselves. Marg mentioned we're keen for a bit of interaction as we're going through, and so we're just sort of curious. I know sort of Catherine, you sort of prompted us in the chats as well. We were just sort of curious how much you're seeing these issues emerge across health and any observations you might have about that. Sort of any sort of reflections. Catherine, you might be sort of open to kicking us off, granted you did so in the chats.
Yeah, I'm feeling a bit triggered, to have to say, because this is just so much what I'm experiencing, and I actually don't feel hopeful at all, because all the attempts that I had done to both articulate the problem and also provide solutions appear to be actively being blocked, either through lack of understanding, or perhaps just not wanting to kind of even acknowledge the issues. So, you know, fragmentation, lack of leadership, the bits not joining up. And so, yeah, I mean, this resonates a lot with me, but it's also, okay, so how can we empower these people other than making them do the course? As a cog in the wheel, how can we kind of make a difference, I think is what I'm feeling at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, there's always a short answer and a long answer to this, isn't there? But the first step is to develop standards. And so there are broad and poorly defined standards. And so what makes for a good standard? And how do you do that? That's part of what we're going to be covering. We are suggesting to you at the end that you can get a copy of both the leadership pipeline and the performance pipeline. Steve Drotter and I wrote the performance pipeline together for quite a few of the chapters. And what our interest is what can we give you that's so practical so you'll be able to see it? How do you write these standards? But step one is that you write the standards. Now, to get the standards is really important, because you can knock out a set of standards pretty quickly. You can write them very quickly. That's not the answer. You need to actually engage people in the process. And the key there is to get heroes and sheroes in the organisation who are respected by the clinicians to draft them up. And so what you do as an exec leadership team is you identify who are the key opinion leaders at this layer, so that when you start talking about the pipeline, the way the pipeline is formed and the way the standards are written are absolutely critical to the success of the rollout. So it's not just about getting standards, that's where you need to get to, but you use the writing of the standards as a way to engage people. And that starts from a conversation about, well, if there were 3 or 4 dimensions that are unique to our organisation that we want to drive, what would those dimensions be? And then when you start talking to your key performers in the organisation, you can use that to guide the conversation. It is a larger engagement process, but it's the most phenomenal. The shift is not what you would expect. Before that, often a lot of your clinicians feel really confused about what leadership is, and it seems to be very idiosyncratic, and different people have got different views. And so they don't want to wade into it because it doesn't feel evidence-based. It doesn't feel validated or scientific. It feels completely arbitrary. But when they can see that there are standards that have been developed and been debated, and that the leadership team has debated it, and that everybody is aware of it, and there are one set of standards and you refine them, what you find is that they accept it and say, thank goodness, where I'm now clear on what my role is and what I'm supposed to be doing. But it is a major blind spot.
Yeah. And I think that the piece that I'd mentioned, particularly given how Catherine kicked us off, is it obviously requires an investment from senior leadership across an organisation to do that sort of work, which if you're feeling like you're in an organisation where you may be the lone voice who can see the challenge and is advocating for change, may not be something that's within your span of control. But our observation is, part of the reason it's causing such pain is because it is literally a blind spot. Everyone can sort of feel the discomfort of it, but it's until you present the clarity of the model, it's like we know it's not working, but we're not quite sure what isn't working. So our experience is even being able to talk about it and have a language for describing it starts to change some of the interactions. And hence, one of the things we're planning to give you as a bit of a thank you for joining us at the webinar this evening is a short article. It has a case, a health-based case study at the back, but it's the sort of thing that you might be able to share with some of your colleagues if you're interested in prompting discussions, which means you don't need to be the voice piece for it. You can just do sort of a, hey, I came across something interesting and I thought this might be worth a discussion, as a way of at least starting to open the door or create an opportunity.
The number one surprise that everybody has is that we often think that it's going to be your hero clinicians who would resist it the most, and what we find is that they embrace it the most, interestingly, counterintuitively.
Ian has a question.
I was going to say that everything you say makes sense to me, but having spent 40 odd years in large health institutions and working in data quality and quality assurance across Australian-wide organisations, I've come to one very, very clear point. You can change the world if you only have two tools. The first one is transparency of process, and the second one is accountability. I've lectured to many, many clinicians over the years, And the common factor has always been, I didn't, and you summarised this earlier, Peter, I didn't know this was happening. I didn't know what the process was. I didn't know how I could value add. Now, move the clinicians to one side, everyone in the organisation's in exactly the same boat. And one of the things, I'll finish on this point, one of the things I used to tell the clinicians is, have you ever sat down with the head of the finance and had a chat? Have you ever sat down with the head of IT and had a chat? Because you'll learn one thing very quickly. They don't talk the same language. And unless you're willing to make a bridge and meet them halfway, a bit like going to a foreign country where you don't speak the language and use sign language, you've got to meet halfway. Yeah. So one of the things that worries me here is without transparency and accountability, using that as my standard, if I may, Peter, then I can start working out whether the leaders that I am dealing with are part of the old boys club, if I can use that probably politically incorrect statement. A lot of my students used to say to me, I put in this budget for this equipment for the last 5 years, it's never been improved. And I usually say to them, did you attend the CEO's barbecue? So what I'm trying to get at here is there is an informal network and there's a formal network. And at the end of the day, it boils down to, unless we can, to get into the game, we've got to get some transparency. And what I usually say is bloom, grow where you're planted, sort of thing. Start making your particular area one that is transparent and accountable. And going back to Peter's point, working with other peers, if you can get a couple of people who start joining that wagon, then hopefully you can bring about change. I'm sorry, that sounded like a lecture rather than a comment, but anyway, thank you.
Dorian, what I really like about what you've highlighted is, I think in health, we tend to underestimate the power of the informal network, but health tends to work on relationships far more than it does on formal structures. So I think it's great that you've brought up accountability. My observation of many health organisations is we wield accountability like a weapon and tend to use it to beat people when they're not meeting expectations, rather than foster a constructive self-accountability where people are embracing something and have both the clarity of role and contribution paired with genuine enthusiastic engagement and wanting to play that role. I think that's what the pipeline delivers in spades is, as a language and as a process. It both helps create that clarity that you were mentioning and the transparency, but the natural lag indicator is a huge upswell in desired accountability rather than grudge activity, which is often what it becomes in health organisations. I'm also loving some of the comments in the chats as well. And I just wanted to sort of mention a couple. I can see that Louise and Megan both sort of mentioned succession and sort of the time commitment that requires, the energy, the courage that it takes for leaders not to interpret succession planning as being a threat to their own role. I think in both cases, the beauty of the pipeline language is it tends to dilute some of those tendencies, because where you have a really robust pipeline, succession isn't an issue because you've actually got people who are ready to make a turn. It's much less disruptive and sort of disjointed when you do find that you need to fill leadership gaps. But equally, when people appreciate the real value they're contributing at their layer of leadership, then somebody else stepping up to that layer isn't a threat anymore if they're ready to make the turn themselves, or they're happy to sort of find another way of contributing value at that layer. So it actually tends to reinforce networks, reinforces that collaborative, collegiate dynamic that we know is health at its best, rather than the cutthroat dynamic of health as a sort of dog-eat-dog world. Excellent. So my sense is we could probably keep talking about pipeline for quite some time. It's meaty and juicy, everyone. So if you're feeling like we just kind of scratched the surface, that would be because you're an astute observer, perhaps a trained observer, and that's correct. But there's lots of resources, as we mentioned. We'll share the links to the 2 books. They're beautifully written by Steve, and Peter contributed to that in no small measure as well. So highly recommend you have a look at them, but the article that we'll share with you will be a good place to start. Unless there are any other sort of questions or thoughts, we might move on to our second driver, which I don't think will be a surprise to many of you. It's a theme that's been coming out in a lot of the thought leadership discussions around health for a while, but from our perspective, we've sort of framed it as the democratization of health. And so, of course, we know that technology is fundamentally changing the world as we know it, the way that society is operating. But we wanted to highlight that it's the unprecedented access to technology that is actually changing the role of clinicians as well as how health is being delivered. And so when you start to look at all of the different new technologies that we're have the benefit of now, whether it's, developments in genomics, personal wearables, remote health monitoring, whatever it is. What we're seeing is that these new technologies are offering not just clinicians, but consumers really that unprecedented real-time access to health data and insights. And so this is fantastic on the one hand, but it's also challenging some of our traditional assumptions about how health data, and more particularly health relationships, are intended to work. And so we're starting to see this focus beginning to shift from the clinician as the holder of the wisdom and the insight and the understanding to the individual themselves. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're probably aware of it's very allocated with patient-centered care, consumer empowerment. There's lots of upside with this. What's fascinating, though, from a social perspective, is that we also, of course, have Dr. Google. And so you have people who are able to interpret data and sort of taking the advantage of, or the chance to be able to really step into owning their own health and well-being. But you also have this dynamic where not just in health, but in so many different places, the very role of experts is being actively challenged across society. I think it's one of the most startling things about the pandemic, is we're getting to see it every time we click on something on social media or watch the news. And so what's challenging at the moment is that clinicians, like so many other experts, are no longer being accepted as having an expert voice, the preeminent voice on a topic. So what does this actually mean in practice? It probably won't surprise you, but what's the punchline of that? And what it really means is, first of all, there's never been a more important time for health leaders in particular to be building their skills to influence and shape behaviours in a constructive way. I think that's not new information, but it's being amplified, as so many things are with the pandemic. Because data alone and insight alone and a diagnosis alone and knowing the right answer is no longer actually sufficient credibility or a value proposition for people to listen to us. So people are wanting and needing more. And so this is creating really big shifts. And as you can see there on the slide, the first really big shift is about moving from managing disease to to leading people. And I know, Peter, this is one that you're particularly passionate about. So I wonder if you just sort of like to chat a little around sort of the value chain piece there. But you might want to share your profundity with us by taking yourself off mute.
Of course. If you think of the health system, it needs to be funded, and the funding models have an assumption that it's a very complicated machine, and the machine has to chug away, and everybody needs to play their part in the machine, which is management. Once again, we end up with this management of the resources across the machine. You're looking at quality control of all the individual, all of that's critical. But there's this other whole dimension, which is it's a complex system, and even the boundary doesn't often exist within the funding models. We need to be able to lead health, lead good health with individuals. This is an engagement, emotional intelligence, empowerment, listening, negotiating, persuading model, rather than a command control, screw this up a little bit harder and turn that down a little bit more and put a little bit of oil on the widget so that the squeaky wheel gets the most oil. That's sort of how our organization works, and often our leader's role is to settle down the squeaky wheels. We've got to take a much more embracing approach, and so your individual consumer sits in a complex system, and so we need to start seeing the role of the emerging leader, health leader. Sure, they've got their clinical responsibilities, but now we need to be able to persuade people to look at what evidence-based actually means, engage them in the process of understanding the upstream issues, the downstream issues, where they sit and how they sit. It's much more complex, it's much more sophisticated, and it's much more nuanced. So the fundamental social role of health is changing. And so there's a whole lot of brand new skills that we need to be able to embrace if we're going to be able to help society transition that in a way that doesn't end up having some real winners who are able to interpret the data correctly versus the real losers.
Now, is that just me?
Society and new technology around the recommendations. Yeah.
Peter, we just got compressed wisdom in a very sort of rapid fire way.
Sure. There it is.
If you can, you disappeared, and then it was sort of almost chipmunk style at the end. I'm just wondering if you could repeat that last bit, if you can remember what it was.
So it's this idea that we need to just administering our part as a cog in the machine won't work anymore.
Yeah.
We're going to need to learn all the leadership and the subtleties of leadership, like influence and persuasion, and giving people the ability to be able to interpret data in a constructive way without telling them how to interpret it, but instead showing them and enabling them to be able to do that. So there's a whole shift in the social role of health and the role that health plays in society, that if we're not careful, we end up with our with new generations understanding it's sort of a 2.0 version of health. But you know, there are going to be, some of us really need to be able to transition into a whole different way of working and talking and operating.
For others amongst you, of course, those who love a little bit of systems theory, who've sort of been indulging a little bit of Dave Snowden or the Cynefin framework, I can see some smiles there. This will be potentially music to your ears that this is gaining traction in health systems around the world. But of course, it may not be a smooth transition. It's a big leap for us to make as an entire sector and industry. So what we're curious about now, granted you have outstanding people on the call with you, and we're keen for you to be able to learn from them and to share with each other as well. We're just going to pop you into some breakout rooms. I know there are some people who are not on your videos, but if you're at least able to be contributing enthusiastically to the discussion, that would be appreciated. We're going to give you about just shy of 10 minutes. And what we're curious about is two questions. Have you seen any evidence of sort of the faint trends emerging around this driver? So this idea that actually the fundamental role of health and the social contract of health is shifting, and what implications might that have for your role? So we're going to pop you into the breakout rooms. You'll see a little screen in a moment pop up on the screen as Rachel seamlessly navigates the technology. You should be able to join your group, and we'll see you back. We'll pop you back into the room in about, just shy of 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Now, I'm not sure if you won the lotto and you were the person who was halfway through a particularly profound sentence. That always seems to happen when the gods of Zoom bounce you back in. But welcome back. We're hoping you had a great discussion. We're also incredibly conscious of time. And so we're keen just to sort of not have a big debrief on that. We're hoping you did that in your breakout rooms. And since we're keen to move on to our final driver for this evening, but we would love just sort of one comment from someone who's sort of willing to mention something they found interesting that came out of the discussion in the group. Anyone feel like there was something that might be useful to share with everybody?
I might go if you like, Anna, very quickly.
Thanks, Chris.
Just hearing some, I guess, from the perspective of healthcare clinicians and how technology has actually changed the ability of people to have access to knowledge, and how that's shifted and the paradigm has changed a little bit around sort of access to knowledge and the difference between authority and actual management and knowledge in that space. So I thought that was wonderful to hear real life experience about that.
Yeah, fantastic, Chris. And I think it's such a maturity curve that we're on, having helped with some of the major sort of digital implementations in the early stages when clinicians were grappling with basic things like how do you manage the transition in terms of still building rapport and managing the consumer and the family and all of those good things. I think initially we had a very sort of functional need to find a way to make the technology work. As it's starting to become less disruptive, we're increasingly realizing the potential that it offers for us, which I think is fantastic. So obviously technology is a big part of discussions that we'll be keen to have if we stay in touch after today's call. But our final driver that we're wanting to share with you this evening is a really important one. And I noticed, Leroy, a couple of sort of scrolls back in the chat, you'd mentioned the factory of healthcare. And I think that sort of goes to the heart of this third driver, which we've described as humanizing healthcare. Because many of the clinicians that we're talking to, those who are working to support clinicians, those who are working to enable, service delivery across community, primary care, all the way through to preventative and integrative health, many people are noting that they went into health with a very deep fervor and passion for making a difference and a genuine care for people, but are finding that somewhere along the way, they've sort of lost their joy in the work that they do. You find it in moments with particular, patients you might be helping or communities that you might be working with, but it's like the dial has been dimmed. And what we're increasingly realizing, and the big driver and trend we're sort of seeing become more sort of apparent for everyone is that we're rediscovering that there's a lost humanity in healthcare. And not only is it incredibly important for our own well-being, those who are working in health, but it's actually critical to being able to deliver for consumers and the community into the future. Because it's interesting, we know that the burden of care and the overstimulation of the system, all of that stuff is likely to continue. That's not new news for anybody. But what we are seeing at the moment that is sort of, I think, a bit of a shock for many people is that there's been this increase in, burnout and mental health and a whole range of other challenges among clinicians and clinical workforces, which, yes, you could attribute many of that to be associated with the pandemic and some of the acute pressures, but much of this has been bubbling away for a while. And so in reality, what we're seeing is a natural consequence of having created a problem-solving machine, as Peter said, where we're focused on diagnosing and solving problems and fixing things. But we've ended up with a system that's actually dehumanized. I think, Lyra, it's a great point. We're talking about humanizing a system that ultimately is made of humans, intended to serve humans. And yet we're finding ourselves in the position where the very humans that are intended to give and to share so generously with others are finding themselves unable to do so. So the big driver that we're increasingly seeing, the trend and what we can see health leaders will be given the opportunity to lean into, is we actually need to be able to reintroduce humanity and compassion back into the equation. And so if we're up to have a chance to be able to deliver high quality care into the future, this won't be a nice to have, as so often sort of these concepts are considered. It's actually going to be core business. And so the big concept we wanted to leave you with is this idea that sort of historically, as if we just sort of click onto the next slide, over the last sort of decade or so, we've had a big focus on consumer experience and wellbeing, which has been fantastic. Plaintree is becoming more and more common. Patient-centered care is now language that hopefully every clinician, everyone working in health is very familiar with. And this has been helpful because perhaps we were a little too focused on our clinical self-oriented before that. We sort of needed to be able to focus and put the consumer absolutely at the heart of the care that we provide. And so workforce experience and wellbeing has been a little bit separate. But what we're actually realizing as we move to the next slide is that these two overlap. You can't actually deliver outstanding consumer experience and well-being if you don't also have a workforce that themselves are experiencing high levels of well-being, because burnout is the answer if you're continuing to give from a bucket or a cup that is being drained. It's almost like we're siphoning off the energy. And so I think this factory of health, part of it is absolutely just the volume and demand that's coming through the door. But more importantly, it's actually in the quality of the interactions that we are having with the people, with our fellow peers that we're working with. And so this is where social cognitive neuroscience has a huge amount to contribute, because more than 30 years worth of social cognitive neuroscience, when you bring it all together, what unites us all is that we're human beings, regardless of whether you're on the consumer or the clinician side of the equation. And we now have a wealth of insight about what actually helps us to be able to be at our best, that enables us to live, to love, to work, to play, to collaborate together, not as a clinician and a consumer, or a clinician as a clinician, or as a, an executive and a frontline worker, but just as human beings. And so the big promise is, rather than waiting for there to be a big reduction in demand, which we would love to see, but all the signs are not pointing towards that suddenly changing anytime soon. The promise lies in how we're doing what we're doing, not suddenly reducing significantly what we need to do. Because it is entirely possible, we know this from many other industries, that you can have teams that are under extraordinary amounts of pressure, doing almost impossible work, and at the end of the day will say, I feel amazing because I feel like I'm doing purposeful work with incredible people, and even if it's a really hard day, I feel better at the end of it than I did at the beginning. It's absolutely possible, and yet for some reason, it's a massive blind spot in health where we give and give to consumers, but we don't give the same to ourselves or to our peers. And so that's something that we're incredibly keen to be sort of shifting. It's a discussion we're having all across different health systems, but it is the big promise for us, is to be able to shift that and to truly humanize health so that it's a better space for all of us in which to do such important work. And so as sort of our final discussion in our remaining sort of 5 minutes or so, we're curious, just again, a Q&A, some reflections, some questions if you have any. Where are you seeing sort of some signs of hope in how we work together and how we work with consumers that might be sort of the early green shoots of some of this humanizing healthcare dynamic? Anyone seeing anything?
I'd say from the COVID experience that we've recognized the importance of being connected within networks that can support us. And we recognize that those networks have probably supported us more than we thought they did. And And I think it also gives us an opportunity to reflect on people with illnesses where they, as they progress through their illness, probably had less networks around them, just by the nature of their illness and the deterioration. And so that gives us an opportunity to reflect on how they must feel in that deterioration. So we can then be more empathic towards them in terms of understanding what they're going through, and then potentially putting in more networks to support them.
Yeah, it's a beautiful point, Leroy. And I think it's fostered a sense of empathy that before we attempted to grapple with. And there's some fascinating studies around just sort of the challenges of managing the two systems in the brain that are linked to sort of high data access and retention versus the empathy circuitry, and the fact that you can't have them coexist in one moment in your brain. So it's like, I feel like we've overemphasized the data diagnostic side, and in the process we've sort of lost touch of some of the human side, not for want of trying. Incidentally, there are many amazing clinicians, amazing health workforce leaders who are actively focused on empathy, but I think you're right, there's nothing like personal experience to be able to really put you in a frame of mind to deliver differently and to interact differently with others. Yeah. Perhaps one other observation before we start wrapping up. Peter, I'm wondering if you had anything to sort of share on that final driver as well.
The role of leadership is really the people dimension. And so many of our models of leadership are actually management, they're not leadership. And so what you've said about the 6 social cognitive needs is very true. We need meaning, and we make meaning. And the meaning that we're often making, many of our people are making in the health system, is that they're not recognised, they're not rewarded. This isn't the social contract that they signed up for. So the question there is, do we change the work, or do we change the meaning that is being made of the work? And there's an evolution, and there's system, there's streamlining things, but there's a whole piece around this strategically and authentically and transparently, and from a heart-based perspective, how do we get the why right? How do we work together in a non-combative way, but rather an active collaboration way? And this is all that soft skills of leadership that we're not really encouraged to use. So that's the new challenge for us. If the system's going to work, we've got a whole bunch of shifting to do as leaders, and I think you've summarised that beautifully, Anna.
There are some beautiful. Oh, sorry. I think that might be you, Ian.
I was just going to ask a question. What do people in this group think the incentives and penalties are associated with leadership in the health system? I can't see any penalties whatsoever, but I'm not even too sure there's any incentives. So I'd be interested to hear others' views as to what the penalties and incentives might be, whichever camp you want to jump to. Because I agree with everything Peter and everybody else has said about leadership. But if you want to bring about change, you've got to change the culture. And to change the culture, there has to be some incentives to change the culture. What are they? Can anybody see them? So when you talk about the changes now, the sort of thought that goes through my mind is, how many of you have dealt with somebody who's got cancer at the moment or dying? Just a show of hands. One.
I think you've got a couple there, Ian.
So my question would be to you, how much control do those individuals have of their own fate? How much information are they given? And where is the leadership to help you? So I'll leave it at that anyway. Some may or may not wish to comment on that.
I think it's a great prompting question, Ian. We've got a couple of people sort of starting to comment in the chats just around, Terence noting that there are some soft incentives in terms of reputation, which I think, social incentives we know are just as powerful from a nudging perspective as some of the hard incentives, depending on the culture and dynamics and the respect for the relationships. And I think there's some voices of hope, sort of Marie questioning sort of some of the approach in terms of incentives, but Leroy saying, the pandemic may in fact bring about cultural change. I think that is a great message of hope, Leroy, on which to be wrapping up our time together this evening. the hope that something that's been so challenging for so many of us can actually be the catalyst for us to be working in a different way. I think that sort of goes back to your comment earlier and the opportunity that we all have as leaders working in health. So as a final point, we're sort of having explored 3 key drivers, we wanted also to leave with some practical suggestions of what you could do. And this sort of harks back to some of the things we'd mentioned earlier. So if you're particularly interested in that first drive around fixing the leadership blind spot, we will be sharing that article that I mentioned earlier on the performance pipeline. It does have that health case study in it if you're interested in just even starting to digest it for yourself and share it with others. But our strong suggestion would be focused first of all on yourself. So get a good sense of whether you're performing at the layer that is appropriate to your level in the organization. And if you feel like it's not working, it's a great opportunity for conversation with either sort of, your leader above, your team around you, to look at what might be standing in the way of that. And there's some useful insights in the books that you can look at as well. But often it's prompts for discussion are a surprisingly powerful place when you have, clinicians who are interested and health people who are interested. In terms of the democratization of health, if you haven't read it, there's a fantastic book that says, patient, the doctor will see you now, or the patient will see you now, which is a great read. We can share the link with you as well. And it's really about being able to focus on your role as an influencer rather than the expert who diagnoses in relation to health. So that's something to be able to ponder. And then in terms of that third piece for humanising healthcare, really importantly, do fix your own oxygen mask first. It's incredibly difficult to give from an empty cup. So I think often in health, we can see that as indulgent. But it really is a baseline step towards being able to contribute as a positive influencer within the health system, whatever that looks like for you. But also to be really clear on how you're wanting to show up as a leader. I think in terms of the incentives that you mentioned earlier, Ian, I think one of the most powerful incentives is our own sense of self and our own identity and the meaning we make in the world. And that's something that we can actively choose for ourselves. We can't enforce it on anybody else, but starting with ourselves is a very powerful ingredient. So again, starting with yourself, but also that third point there, just being able to affirm those who demonstrate humanness. I remember leading a session for a critical care division. They brought their whole team together and we did an exercise at the end where we just shared what they appreciated about the different roles within the team. There were tears at the end of a session together because it was the first time anybody had actually stopped to say how much they appreciated that within the team. It wasn't consumer driven. It wasn't happy, sheets or scores. It was just their peers saying, I really appreciate that you do this every day for the sake of our team and the sake of our consumers. So it's surprisingly powerful. I think we underestimate it. So I think that brings us to the end of our time together. We've just got a final slide there. If anybody is interested in sort of the more detailed course in terms of a where to from here, please let us know. You can use the QR code there if you're interested in more detail. We're happy to stick around if you've got any questions. But otherwise, Marg, any sort of final comments to wrap us up for our time together?
No, just great. Thank you so much, Anna, Peter and Rachel. And I think those people who know me know how excited I am to be partnering with Neuropower, and now they know why. So thank you.